Open a coffee shop. Find a corner spot, buy a nice espresso machine, hire a friendly barista, and watch people line up every morning for a $5 latte. That's the mental picture almost everyone starts with. A cup of coffee sells for $5. The beans and the milk inside it cost less than 60 cents. That's a gross margin north of 80%, which sounds like one of the best businesses a person could possibly get into. And yet, somewhere between 50 and 74% of independent coffee shops close within their first 5 years. Nearly 4 in 10 don't even make it to their first birthday. So here's the real question nobody asks before signing a lease. If coffee is one of the highest markup drinks a human being can sell, where does all the money actually go? Walk past a busy cafe some morning, every table full, a line out the door, steam rising off the machine like a small factory. It looks like money. It looks like the owner in the back should be doing very well for themselves. Except the owner is usually the person working the espresso machine themselves, 70 hours a week, because paying a second barista would erase what little profit is left. Many cafe owners end up earning less than the people they employ. And the strange part is, it's almost never because the coffee was bad. Most first-time owners walk in assuming the hard part is the product. Learn to pull a good shot. Source good beans. Get the milk texture right. Draw a nice leaf in the foam. None of that is what decides whether the business survives. The thing that quietly eats the business alive isn't the beans, the cups, or the milk. It's something almost every new owner underestimates by a wide margin, and by the time they understand it, they're usually already losing money. Before we even get to the drink, there's a decision most new owners rush through without realizing how much it matters: the size of the place itself. A tiny kiosk or a walk-up window looks cheap and manageable on paper, and it is, right up until the owner realizes it can only ever serve a handful of customers at once, capping revenue no matter how good the coffee is. A mid-sized cafe with a few tables costs more to open and more to staff, but it can actually absorb a morning rush without the line spilling onto the sidewalk. A larger cafe with a full seating area and a kitchen looks the most impressive, and is by a wide margin the most expensive to run. More square footage to lease, more staff to cover it, more equipment to maintain. The cheapest option to open is very often the option that caps how much money the business can ever make, and the most expensive option to open is very often the one that becomes unaffordable to keep alive during a slow month. Almost nobody chooses the middle tier on their first try, and almost everyone wishes they had. Let's actually take that $5 latte apart piece by piece and see where the money goes before it ever reaches the owner's pocket. Start with the ingredients. 60 cents. Coffee, milk, a splash of syrup if there's flavoring involved. Add the cup, the lid, the cardboard sleeve, call it another 30 cents. So far under $1. This is the part everyone focuses on, and this is the part that barely matters. Now add labor. The barista who made the drink, the payroll taxes on top of their wage, whatever benefits the shop offers. On a typical $5 drink, labor eats about $1.75. That's 35% of the entire sale, gone, before the owner has paid rent on the building the drink was made in. Speaking of rent, 75 cents of that $5 goes straight to the landlord, the property taxes, the insurance, and what's politely called common area maintenance. Depending on the neighborhood, occupancy alone can run anywhere from 10 to 20% of everything the cafe takes in. Then there's the part almost nobody thinks about until they see the bill. Every time a customer taps a card instead of paying cash, the cafe loses a slice of that transaction to the payment processor. 15 cents on a $5 sale doesn't sound like much, but add it up over a year of thousands of small transactions, and it becomes real money. One documented independent coffee and retail shop spent $18,645 in a single year just on card processing fees, more than they spent on coffee beans for the entire year. Keep going. Utilities, point-of-sale software, licensing, call it another 40 cents. Waste, the espresso shots that get dialed in and thrown away, the milk that goes past its date, 15 more cents. Taxes on the income itself, another 25 cents. Add all of that up, and out of a $5 latte, the cafe is left with somewhere around 65 cents of actual profit, assuming absolutely nothing goes wrong that week. That's about 13%. Not the 80% everyone imagined when they looked at the cost of the beans. Sounds survivable, right? 13 cents on the dollar, multiplied by enough cups a day, should still add up to a living. Here's the problem. Selling twice as many lattes does not mean making twice as much profit. In most businesses, doubling your output spreads your fixed costs thinner and your margins get better. A coffee shop doesn't work that way, because a coffee shop isn't really selling drinks. It's renting out 90 to 120 minutes of intense morning demand and almost nothing else. That's the entire crisis of the business, condensed into one number. The morning rush lasts about an hour and a half to 2 hours. Everything the cafe earns in a day is mostly earned in that window. To serve more people in that same narrow window, the owner needs more staff on the clock and faster machines pulling shots, machines that cost $10,000 to $30,000 apiece. So the owner buys the second machine, hires the extra hands, and now has the capacity to serve the morning crowd twice as fast. But here's the catch. The extra staff and the extra equipment don't disappear once the rush ends at 10 in the morning. The machine sits there, paid for, doing nothing until tomorrow's rush. The staff scheduled for a full 8-hour shift are still being paid at 2 in the afternoon when the cafe is nearly empty. During the rush, labor might cost less than $1.50 for every drink made. By mid-afternoon, with the same staff standing around and almost no one walking through the door, labor cost per drink can balloon past $4 a cup. Busy is not the same thing as profitable. A cafe can look packed every single morning and still lose money every single month because the cost of being ready for the rush doesn't turn off when the rush does. So chasing more customers isn't the answer. If raw volume doesn't save the business, which customers are actually keeping the lights on? Not the commuter who grabs a small coffee and is gone in 90 seconds. That customer is barely worth the transaction fee. The customers who actually matter are the regulars, the ones who come back 10 or 15 times a month, order a specialty drink instead of a plain coffee, and add something else to the ticket. A loyalty member typically spends 20 to 30% more per visit than someone walking in cold. The average ticket at a well-run independent cafe sits somewhere between $7.81 and $12, nearly double the price of the coffee alone. That gap between one drink and one drink plus something else is where the real profit lives. Break the customer base down into rough groups, and the gap becomes obvious. The transit commuter passes through 15 to 20 times a month, spends $3 to $5 each visit, and is gone before the receipt prints. Over a month, that's barely $100 of total value. The loyalty regular comes in just as often, but spends $12 to $18 a visit because they're adding a pastry or a bag of beans to go, pushing their monthly value past $200, roughly double the commuter, for the same number of trips through the door. A remote worker who camps out with a laptop a few times a week might only visit 5 to 8 times a month, but orders more than one drink and a snack each time, landing somewhere in between. None of these customers cost the cafe anything extra to acquire. They're already walking in. The only question is which ones the cafe is actually built to capture, which is exactly why smart cafe owners obsess over getting a customer to add one more item. If a customer already buying a $5 latte also grabs a $4 pastry, the total sale just jumped 80%, without hiring a single additional employee or running the espresso machine any longer. This is why the menu is never arranged by accident. A $7 specialty drink placed at the top of the board makes the standard $5 latte look like the reasonable choice, nudging people toward upgrades and add-ons without a single word from the person behind the counter. And here's where it gets interesting. The item quietly outperforming the coffee itself is usually the pastry case. A croissant that costs about 55 cents to make can sell for $4.50. That's a food cost of roughly 12%, even better than the drink sitting next to it. The catch is how you get that pastry. Bake it in-house, and you capture the full margin, but you also need ovens, proofers, a dedicated kitchen, and a baker who has to show up at 4 in the morning, regardless of how many customers walk in that day. Buy it wholesale from a local bakery instead, and the margin drops to somewhere around 50 to 60%, still excellent. But the cafe avoids the cost of specialized equipment and overnight labor entirely. Push further into hot food, and the economics turn hostile fast. A single commercial exhaust hood alone can cost $10,000 to $20,000 to install, and once fire suppression systems and custom ductwork get added, that number can climb past $50,000. Add a grease trap, which can run anywhere from $2,000 for a small unit to $40,000 for one that requires cutting into the concrete floor, and a simple kitchen expansion turns into one of the largest expenses in the entire business. This is exactly why the most disciplined specialty cafes deliberately keep their food menu small. Every extra item on that menu is either money in the register or spoiled inventory in the trash by closing time, and there is very little room in between. If the product mix alone can't explain who survives and who doesn't, maybe the real business decision was made before the first customer ever walked in. The address: 2 cafes can have identical menus, identical espresso machines, identical branding, and produce completely different results, simply because one sits on the correct side of the street and the other doesn't. Foot traffic decides almost everything. A location next to a subway stop or inside a dense office corridor captures customers who were already walking past anyway, at almost no marketing cost. A corner unit often costs 50% more in rent than the space next door on the same block, and it's usually worth it because a corner catches foot traffic moving in two directions instead of one, along with far better visibility from the street. Commercial leases rarely stop at the base rent number posted in the listing. Most are structured on what's called a triple net basis, meaning the tenant also covers a share of property taxes, building insurance, and maintenance on top of rent, sometimes adding several dollars per square foot every year before a single cup of coffee is sold. And in busier retail corridors, landlords often add what's called a percentage rent clause. Once the cafe's sales cross an agreed threshold, called the breakpoint, the tenant starts paying the landlord a slice, often 5 to 8% of every dollar earned above that line, on top of the base rent already being paid. If a cafe pays an annual base rent of $150,000 under a 5% clause, the natural breakpoint sits at $3 million in yearly sales. Push past that, and every additional dollar sold gets taxed twice, once by the government, once by the landlord. Sign a lease with the breakpoint set artificially low, and an inexperienced owner can end up handing over a percentage of sales long before the business has actually turned a real profit. These leases typically lock an owner in for 5 to 10 years, usually backed by a personal guarantee, meaning if the cafe fails, the debt follows the owner personally, not just the business. Pick the wrong corner or sign the wrong lease terms, and there is often no fixing it later. You simply ride it out. For a suburban location instead of an urban one, the same logic shows up in a different form. It's not foot traffic that matters most, it's the parking lot. A commuter deciding whether to stop for coffee on the way to work will happily drive several minutes out of their way for a location with easy in and out parking, and will just as happily skip a closer option if it means fighting a difficult left turn across oncoming traffic. The product hasn't changed at all between those two locations. Only the 3 seconds it takes to decide whether stopping is worth the hassle. Even with a perfect location locked down, there's still one more wall standing between the idea and the first customer: the cost of actually building the place. Most first-time owners budget for furniture, paint, and a nice espresso machine, and stop there. The real number is far larger. A small kiosk can open the doors for around $83,000. A full sit-down cafe, done properly, often runs past $400,000, and sometimes closer to $500,000. Equipment and machinery alone can run $20,000 to $80,000. Plumbing, electrical upgrades, and structural build-out, the unglamorous part nobody photographs for the opening day post, can cost anywhere from $20,000 to $150,000, depending on what the building looked like before the cafe moved in. Add furniture, signage, a security deposit, licensing, a website, and 3 to 6 months of working capital to survive before the business breaks even, and the number keeps climbing. An espresso machine needs its own dedicated high-voltage electrical line and direct plumbing with filtration. The kind of installation that turns a simple space into a construction project. And even after the money is spent, city inspections and permit approvals routinely take 2 to 6 months. If the lease only came with 60 days of free rent, the owner is now paying full rent on an empty, unfinished space for months before serving a single customer. Running out of cash before opening day, not a lack of customers after opening day, is one of the single most common reasons these businesses fail before they ever really begin. And even once the doors are open, revenue flowing, staff trained, one bad week can undo months of work. Picture it. The main espresso machine's pump fails during the Tuesday morning rush. The same morning, the lead barista calls in sick. The walk-in refrigerator's compressor dies overnight, and by the time anyone notices, hundreds of dollars of milk has gone warm. On top of it, the weekly delivery of cups is delayed because of a supplier issue. None of these events are rare on their own. Together, in the same week, they're a financial gut punch. Losing the espresso machine during the morning rush alone can cost a cafe $500 to $1,500 in lost sales in a single day, and it sends loyal customers straight to whichever competitor happens to be open down the block. This isn't hypothetical. Between 2020 and 2022, supply shortages hit paper cups, milk, and coffee beans all at once, while labor shortages forced many independent owners to abandon the office side of the business and go stand behind the counter themselves just to stay open. And when something breaks, it rarely breaks on a convenient weekday. Emergency repair technicians typically charge $100 to $150 an hour for standard visits, and that rate can climb to $150 to $225 an hour for a weekend emergency call. One bad week of breakdowns, spoiled inventory, and rush repair bills can wipe out months of hard-earned profit in a matter of days. And the damage doesn't stop when the machine gets fixed. Regular customers who got turned away during that one bad week don't automatically come back the following Monday. Some of them simply form a new habit at whichever cafe was open when theirs wasn't, and that lost routine can take months to win back, if it ever comes back at all. Now compare all of that fragility to how a large chain operates, and the gap becomes obvious. Starbucks alone buys roughly 3% of the entire world's green coffee supply, more than 5 million bags a year. That kind of volume gives a chain negotiating power an independent cafe owner will simply never have access to, on everything from beans to milk to the paper cups themselves. A large chain runs its own roasting facilities, its own distribution network, and its own mobile ordering technology, which means its average gross margin often lands between 75 and 85%, compared to 60 to 70% for an independent. And because a chain operates hundreds or thousands of locations at once, it can comfortably let one expensive flagship store lose money for years, quietly covering that loss with profit from hundreds of efficient, lower-cost locations elsewhere. An independent cafe doesn't have that luxury. It has exactly one location, and that one location has to work. When a chain's mobile app knows exactly how many oat milk lattes to expect at 8 in the morning on a Tuesday, and pre-stages the order before the customer even walks in, an independent cafe is still relying on a barista's memory of the regulars and a handwritten sticky note behind the register. Both approaches can produce a good cup of coffee. Only one of them scales without breaking. So how does a small independent cafe compete with that kind of scale at all? Not on price and not on speed, because it will lose both fights every time. It competes by selling something a global chain structurally cannot replicate: the feeling of a specific place, made by specific people, that customers choose to be loyal to. This is really what powered the rise of what's often called specialty or third-wave coffee. Roasters started selling direct trade, single-origin beans instead of anonymous commodity coffee, and customers who once refused to pay more than $2 for a basic cup started happily paying $7 to $9 for a carefully made pour-over. The raw ingredient cost barely moved. The price customers were willing to pay moved dramatically. That gap, pennies of extra ingredient cost against dollars of extra retail price, is what allowed small operators to build real margin without needing Starbucks-level buying power. This kind of pricing power also does something quieter but just as valuable. It insulates the cafe from the up and down swings of the global commodity coffee market. A chain buying anonymous beans by the ton is exposed to every price spike in the futures market. A small roaster selling a story along with the beans can raise prices gradually as costs rise. Because the customer isn't really comparing the price to a commodity chart, they're comparing it to the last time they had a cup this good. Brands like Stumptown, Intelligentsia, Blue Bottle, and Counterculture were all, at some point, a single struggling neighborhood cafe. What eventually made them different wasn't the coffee itself. It was everything they built around it. But even with premium pricing working in their favor, every cafe, cheap or expensive, runs into the same brutal fact of the business. The payroll clock never actually stops. A barista isn't just paid while pulling shots for a paying customer. They're paid while cleaning the machine, restocking the fridge, calibrating the grinder, and opening or closing the shop. None of that time makes the cafe a single dollar, and all of it has to be paid for. Add in the fact that customer traffic can vanish the instant it starts raining, or a train gets delayed, or a holiday empties out the office buildings nearby, and a fully staffed cafe can suddenly find itself paying wages for a shift with almost nobody to serve. Training a new barista to run a commercial machine and produce a consistent drink takes real time and real payroll, and if that employee leaves after a few months, all of that investment walks out the door with them. On top of it, the regulatory ground keeps shifting. In several states, including some of the most expensive real estate markets in the country, employers are legally required to pay the full state minimum wage directly, sometimes over $15 or $16 an hour, with tips counted as pure extra income on top, rather than something the owner can count toward the wage. That single policy difference can push labor costs from roughly a third of revenue to closer to 40% in one line item. Scheduling around all of this is its own constant puzzle. Too few staff on the floor during a surprise rush, and service slows down, lines grow, and customers who are in a hurry simply leave without ordering. Too many staff scheduled for a rush that doesn't materialize because of rain or a holiday, and the cafe is paying full wages to stand around a mostly empty room. There is no software that perfectly predicts a Tuesday morning, which is why so many owners end up doing the scheduling themselves by feel, based on years of watching their own door. Given all of that, the fragile margins, the rigid labor costs, the unforgiving lease terms, why do experienced owners keep opening more cafes instead of walking away? Because the ones who actually make real money figured out sooner or later that the cafe itself was never supposed to be the whole business. Selling brewed coffee across a counter, one cup at a time, is one of the least profitable ways to sell coffee. The cafe's real job for a well-run operation is to act as a storefront, proof that the brand and the product are good while the actual profit gets built somewhere else. roasting beans and selling them wholesale to other cafes, offices, and grocery stores, runs at high volume with excellent margin, without needing more baristas or another storefront. A monthly bean subscription shipped straight to a customer's home produces steady, predictable revenue that doesn't care whether it rained that morning. And a simple retail bag of beans sitting on the counter, say $16 to the customer, $9 to produce, hands the cafe $7 of pure profit without requiring a single minute of barista labor. That one bag is worth roughly the same profit as 4 lattes made, served, and cleaned up after. This is exactly the path the biggest specialty brands in the country followed. They started as one small neighborhood cafe and grew because they stopped treating the cafe as the entire company. So let's actually run the two versions of this business, side by side, and see what owning one really looks like in a given year. Take a well-located independent cafe doing about $500,000 in sales for the year. A realistic number for an established, reasonably busy shop. In the optimistic scenario, everything the owner controls is dialed in. The lease was negotiated fairly, without a punishing percentage rent clause. Labor is scheduled tightly around actual demand instead of guesswork, so nobody stands idle during the 2 o'clock lull. The pastry case is sourced wholesale instead of built out as an expensive in-house kitchen, avoiding 6 figures of construction cost entirely. Loyalty members are driving up the average ticket, and a modest wholesale or subscription channel is adding steady income that doesn't depend on the weather. Added up, and a well-optimized cafe can land a net margin in the range of 15 to 18%, putting somewhere around $75,000 to $90,000 a year in the owner's pocket after every single expense, including their own labor behind the counter. Now the realistic scenario, built from the same starting revenue. The lease includes a percentage rent clause the owner didn't fully understand at signing, and by autumn sales have crossed the breakpoint. Turnover forces 2 separate rounds of hiring and retraining over the course of the year, each one costing weeks of payroll before the new hire is fully productive. A refrigerator compressor dies in July, right in the middle of a heat wave, taking a full weekend's worth of dairy inventory with it. A card processor quietly raises its swipe rate in September, and nobody in the office notices for 2 months. None of these events are dramatic on their own. Stacked together across 12 months, they are simply what an ordinary year looks like for most independent owners. Under those far more common conditions, that same $500,000 in sales nets out closer to 5 to 8%, somewhere around $25,000 to $40,000 for the entire year, split across 70-hour weeks, which works out to less than what many of the cafe's own employees take home. The difference between the good version of this business and the ordinary version of this business is roughly $50,000 a year. And that gap is decided almost entirely before opening day by the lease that gets signed, the equipment that gets bought, and the staffing plan that gets built long before a single cup of coffee is ever poured. So the next time a $5 latte gets handed across a counter, the coffee inside it was never really the product being sold. The real product was always the real estate, the labor schedule, the lease terms, and the handful of decisions the owner made months before opening,